This podcast is a proud member of the Unidentified Network.
So now, ladies and gentlemen, live and in colour, it's Mr. Wayne Lovejuice.
The other day our producer Louis had a chat with an interesting chappie who said that the YouTube algorithm really aren't that happy. If a channel only broadcasts once a week, so we've decided we can text ya whenever we've got a piece of news in our new book on the Track Extra. Whilst we were recording this next piece with Richard, I discovered something really rather peculiar, and when I looked into it, both Richard and I first jumped to the conclusion that it was some sort of piece of woke nonsense. But in fact it's not. We were doing, and as you'll see in a minute, a show about an extinct version of the plains zebra, which was originally thought to be a subspecies and then was demoted to just being a race of the plains zebra. And when I read that it was no longer a race, even it was called an ecotype, I immediately jumped to the conclusion that this was because the word race was somehow thought to be offensive these days, and that it would need a trigger warning before we showed it. This made me very angry, because I hate the bastardization and degrading of the English language for political correctness reasons. But it turned out to be nothing of the sort, so many apologies to everybody who thought the same as me. Because the term race, when used in the context of animal classification, was actually a completely unofficial and confusing appellation, because there were at least three different things, three different types of variation: regional variation, colour variation, and morphologic variation, which were called race, when there were actually three totally different types of variation. And the word ecotype covers what would probably have been just called race, but it is actually a morphological variation which isn't up to the level of being a subspecies, but is in itself a sub-subspecies, if you like, of, in this case, the plains zebra. For those of you who don't know, here is the main set of classifications that are commonly used throughout the internationally agreed scientific community. There is an organisation called the International Union of Biological Science, which was formed round about the time of the First World War, and one of the charter members of it is another organisation called the International Commission on Zoological Nomenclature, or the ICZN, which was founded in September 1895. And they are responsible for something called the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature. And for those of you who don't know it, This is the internationally agreed levels of zoological nomenclature. And because Archie has complained that he's not been in the show so far, we're going to go through his classification, the classification of the domestic dog.
It's about time you had the little dog on the show.
The largest classification in the tree of life are the domains. There are 3 domains: the bacteria, the archaea and the eukarya. Specimens from all 3 of these contain ribosomal RNA, but that's pretty well all that they have got in common. I guess you probably all know what bacteria are, but archaea are another type of single-celled creature. But we, and all the other organisms known on the planet, and especially the animals that we're interested in here in this show, belong to a domain called eukarya. Members of the domain eukarya, which are called eukaryotes, have membrane-bound organelles, and which include a nucleus containing genetic material and are represented by 5 kingdoms: the plantae, the protozoa, the animalia, the chromista and the fungi.
I'm sick and tired of hearing about organisms that only have RNA and don't even have cell membranes. Eukarya are the only ones that matter. The others are all stupid.
I'm sure you will all easily deduce that the kingdom Animalia consists of animals. And I'm sure that you all probably deduce that the phylum Chordata consists of animals with a spinal cord. And I expect that you'll be able to deduce that the class Mammalia means that they are mammals, meaning that the mothers produce milk to feed their babies, and I expect that you'll be able to deduce that the order Carnivora means that they are carnivores, meaning that they are probably, but not all cases, creatures that eat meat, whether that meat is large on the hoof or tiny insects. They eat other creatures. Now, the carnivora are split into 2 main categories: the dog-like ones and the cat-like ones. And this next category, Caninidae, is the dog-like ones, and the genus Canis is the true dogs. And then, much to Archie's great pleasure, comes the species Canis lupus, which is the grey wolf. And finally, we have the subspecies of the grey wolf, which is the domesticated dog.
I'm very proud of my lupine heritage. I'm not just a little dog, I'm a grey wolf, and everybody should treat me with respect. Grr!
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you might think that this episode so far is a complicated mixture of odds and sods, which is all going in different directions. Well, it's not, I promise. It all comes out in the wash. But first, I want to introduce you once again to Richard Freeman, who's going to explain the story behind one of the 20th century's greatest Fortean zoological mysteries.
In the early 1960s, the cryptozoologist Ivan T. Sanderson was on an American chat show, and he showed the host a picture from either a magazine or a book, and the picture was of a huge bird, dead and pinned up to the side of a barn, and beneath it were a bunch of men with their arms held out, fingertip to fingertip, to show how big the wingspan of this bird was. And apparently it was immense, 30 feet or more. Now, that clip, that show has been lost, but many people remember seeing it And what's more, many people remember seeing the photograph either in a magazine or a book on the Wild West. And the strange thing is, some people say that this is a eagle-like feathery bird, like the thunderbird of Native American mythology, but other people seem to recall seeing something like a pterosaur with leathery wings and reptilian looking. Nobody has ever managed to track down the magazine or the book that it was in. One person said they thought it was in a book on the Old West that had a green dust cover, but no one anywhere has managed to find the missing Thunderbird photograph. And some people think that this is like the Mandela effect. They're misremembering something from their youth or creating false memory.
I actually vaguely remember seeing something like the Thunderbird photograph when I was a little boy in Hong Kong. I vaguely remember it being in a comic, because the only place that one could ever see American comics was in the barbers, where my parents always took me kicking and screaming to have my hair cut. And I vaguely remember seeing something like the Thunderbird photograph then, but that's a completely different story. I want to tell you about another maybe misremembered photograph. This is Baron Walter Rothschild, who is best known to history as a dedicated zoologist and the founder of the Tring Natural History Museum. But he was also an eccentric who, as you see here, used to ride zebras and have zebras, trained zebras, pull his carriage. Now, I first saw these pictures when I was a little boy, because my granddad showed me a picture, and this would have been mid-60s sometime when I was about 7 or 8. My granddad showed me a picture of Baron Rothschild with his carriage pulled by zebras, and the bridle of the forward zebra was being held by a little boy. And my granddad said, "You know who that little boy is?" And I said, "No, Granddad." And he said, "That was me when I was your age." Now, the trouble is, I remember the picture with the little boy totally clearly, and I know I've seen it since, but every time that I've tried to find it on the internet, I can't find any trace of it. So, this is a picture of Walter Rothschild and his zebras, which will probably give you some sort of a clue of what we're talking about in this episode, because we're going to talk about zebras.
The quagga was a type of zebra found in the more arid regions of South Africa. It was thought to have been hunted to extinction in the 19th century, the last one dying in Amsterdam Zoo in 1883. In fact, it broke its leg by falling over and had to be shot by its keeper. More recently, an amazing discovery was made. Around about 30 years ago, some work was being done on the skin of a quagga from a museum, and they extracted DNA from it and found out that the quagga was not a individual species, it was just a race of the plain zebra with very distinctive markings. It didn't have stripes along the rump like most zebras do, and it had this brownish colour to it. So the Quagga project was instigated, and the Quagga project seeks to resurrect the quagga by breeding plain zebras with the most quagga-like features and backbreeding them to get an approximation of the quagga. They breed plain zebra that have a brownish tint to them, that have fewer stripes on the rump area, and then they breed the young from those and so forth until they've got an approximation of the quagga, and it's doing quite well. We now have plain zebra that do indeed resemble quagga. So I had an amazing idea whilst walking through Newton Abbot the other day. I could do my own version of the Quagga project, but on a much smaller scale and for much less cost. Now, back in the 1980s, there was a chocolate bar that was very, very popular called the Cabana. It was delicious. It was milk chocolate with coconut in it and cherries inside. A little bit like a Bounty bar, but with cherries. And I thought, why not use the Quagga project as a template to try and back engineer the Cabana bar. All you need, and why anybody has not done this before, I don't know. All you need is a Bounty bar and glacé cherries. So let's see, in the name of science, how well this works. Well, it's a reasonable approximation. The glacé cherries, I feel, are a little bit tackier, more syrupy than the cherries they had in the Cabana. So let's try it with a fresh cherry, although they didn't use fresh cherries in the original. Let's see how this works out. The glacé cherry is more similar to the Cabana than the fresh cherry. Now, you must remember that the cherry was actually embedded within the coconut, and as I've mentioned before, it's less syrupy, less tacky, but it's a step forward. It's one small step on an ongoing scientific project to try and resurrect the Cabana bar. In fact, there's an online petition to get the Cabana bar resurrected. Now, if this is successful and we get the Cabana bar back, it could be the start of something big, because we could then resurrect the Texan bar, the Aztec bar, the Pyramint, all these great chocolates from the past that are now no longer with us. And when I was hunting the Tasmanian wolf in Tasmania, I noticed that in Australia they have many, many more types of chocolate, much greater variety than they do in the UK. They have chocolate bars that have raspberry infused coconut in them, for example, and dozens of different types. Over here we seem to have a very much denuded population of chocolates, and that needs to change, and resurrecting the Cabana bar is just the beginning.
But I'm not going to leave it there, because despite the fact it may look like it was just us being silly, Richard's attempt to create a veritable Jurassic Park of 1970s and 1980s confectionery actually has a hard scientific piece of logic behind it, because that's what science is. With science, with the scientific method, which has basically been going ever since, I think it was Aristotle who first came up with the broad concept, so it's been going for over 2,400 years. The basic idea is that you come up with a hypothesis, you test the hypothesis, and then you examine the hypothesis again to see if it needs to be, I'm not sure, I can't remember what the word is, whether it needs to be modified in the light of the experiment results. And then this time the experiment was, could you make one of these long lost types of chocolate bar out of a Bounty bar and glacé cherries? And the answer is that it didn't taste quite right, and that when you tried it with fresh cherries, it tasted even less right. And so the next experiment, which we will probably do here live on CFZ TV, will be for Richard to try it with maraschino cherries, which are sweeter than fresh cherries, but not as sickly as glacé cherries. Okay, they're also dipped in alcohol, but that isn't really the point. That actually is using the scientific method. Now, to go back to the original thing about the quagga, or if you want to call it in Afrikaans, the quagga, it is one of the very few animals that have basically been reconstituted. And the reason it's been reconstituted through selective breeding is that, as the quagga turned out actually to be the nominate subspecies of the plain zebra, which has the Latin name Equus quagga, and the subspecies that was the quagga is Equus quagga quagga, the genotype of the genome of the quagga was hidden within the population genetics of the plain zebra in South Africa, and selective breeding hasn't actually produced a quagga, but has produced something that looks like a quagga, quacks like a quagga, and does the same job that a quagga does. So it is pretty much a quagga. But there are all sorts of other plans in progress to be able to resurrect, I think probably the word, to resurrect extinct species. For example, they are hoping to use genetic material from frozen mammoths that were frozen in the Siberian permafrost inside the ova of a female Asian elephant, which is the most recent and the closest living relative to the extinct mammoths, in order to make new mammoths which will walk the earth. Well, it won't. It'll make a bastardized Asian elephant that may look a bit like a mammoth. And they're hoping to do the same thing, apparently, with the dodo. And they're going to use genetic material from dodos, and they're going to use host mothers who are chickens or turkeys. But I can't see how that's going to work, because the closest relation to the dodo would be one of the pigeons. Richard, what's the species is it that's the closest relation to the dodo?
The tooth-billed pigeon and the Nicobar pigeon, I think, are the two.
According to Richard, it's the tooth-bar pigeon and the Nicobar pigeon. And I think, because they're far too small to be host parents to dodos, I think a hell of a lot more work would have to be done to be able to use an almost completely unrelated host parent. And they're planning to do it with the thylacine. And they're using a quokka, isn't it? Richard, what's the closest relation to the thylacine?
The closest relation to the thylacine living is the fat-tailed dunnart, which is not much bigger than a mouse.
Do you know, Richard, how this is going to work? How are they going to plan to do it?
I don't know what host species they're going to use. In terms of size, the Tasmanian devil would be the best bet, but it's still a lot smaller. And anyway, I don't think that the thylacine or the Tasmanian wolf is actually extinct. I think it's still there in Tasmania and probably on New Guinea as well.
And I personally have misgivings about the idea of trying to recreate and producing a bastard creature that looks a bit like the one you're trying to recreate but isn't the one you're trying to recreate, and introducing it into an area where the remnants of the original population might still be living. Britain did that in about 1981, I think it was. Up until 1978, the large blue butterfly was living in various places in Britain, and the last ones were supposed to have died out on Harkland Point, which is only about 7 miles from here, in 1978, 1977 or 1978. Well, they didn't die out. I know that because I saw one in 1979. But now, specimens very closely related but different subspecies from the subspecies that lives in Scandinavia have been reintroduced into a lot of parts of Britain, and they're thriving and doing very well, but that means that any remnants of the original species that are left are going to be wiped out through genetic dilution, which I think is a great pity. I think when one is messing about with Mother Nature, one should be far more careful than one is being. But that's just me.